I ran across recently a book called Mr. Potts and Me. It's written by Damon L. Fordham. He's a local man. He's a teacher, as a matter of fact, but he's also a very accomplished writer. And he has a book that talks about Mr. Potts and me. And Mr. Potts is?
Basically, he is a fictional composite of my father, a man named Abraham Fordham, who taught at Lang High in Mount Pleasant for over 30 years, and a local gentleman named Mr. Walter Snipe, who partially raised my mother.
I see. So between these two characters, if you will, who you have still very vivid memories with your dad, and then the other guy, we're not always so sure. I don't know if this is the guy that kind of took in Lucas in the book, or,
exactly.
And all these stories generally are told in the woodshed or the tool shed or a little place out back.
Well, generally, for the people who are yet to be familiar with the book, it's basically the idea of this lonely and confused young boy who's loosely based on myself and my childhood experiences. And he finds solace with this elderly gentleman who kind of gets him through life by telling him all these fascinating folk tales and history. And that's based on the stories that my father told me as I was growing up, because that's such a lost art these days.
Well, it is. And I guess there's a reason some of it is lost, I guess, Damon, because we don't gather around the supper table like we once did, do we? Or we don't take the time to listen to maybe what some of the elders might have to say, right?
Exactly, and that's one of the main reasons that I wrote this book, not only to preserve my father and his stories and such, but also to encourage the revival of that tradition, because the sad thing is that when people start talking about their elderly relatives, they always try to mention, well, remember that story they told of such and such, and people forget that because they didn't sit down and write this stuff down. And that's basically the kind of thing that the book is to encourage people to do that with their own relatives, so that these stories aren't forever lost to the graveyards.
You do a terrific job, I think, of kind of intertwining kind of life lessons, if you will.
Exactly.
That Mr. Potts seems to always have an example of, regardless of the circumstance or situation.
Well, that's the idea too, because we're living in a society now where the young people are just not getting that, because this type of tradition, unfortunately, died out with the last couple of generations due to television and electronic media and so forth. And so a lot of people are sort of grasping for straws in trying to understand how they should live their lives in a productive manner. And so I'm not saying this book is a substitute for that, but I think it'll give some people some ideas on a lot of things along those lines.
And does the problem kind of just become the world we live in, where, you know, kind of that microwave generation where we want everything kind of instantly, and we're very tough to kind of stay zeroed in on a particular topic for any length of time, because we get that and then we move on to the next thing?
Well, I think that has a lot to do with it too. And then, of course, you also have the breakdown of the nuclear family over the last couple of generations that has helped with this, whereas it used to be that a number of generations would be in the same community and you would have this strong tradition being passed down, but that's relatively rare these days. People move more often and they have less of that interaction between generations as they once did. And of course, you can never make time go back to as it was, but I do think that you could encourage people to hold on to traditions of that kind, because I think that those of us who've experienced it, it helped make us stronger people. And so it's important to pass that strength on to future generations.
One of the characters in the book is Lucas, who kind of comes under the wing, if you will, after school each day, because his mom wants him to be influenced, right?
Exactly.
By somebody that is like Mr. Potts.
Exactly.
And so you say that's loosely kind of draped around some of your own childhood experiences?
Well, up to a point, because my father was there.
Okay.
Pretty much. And he died, however, when I was a relatively young age. But I remembered enough of what he had to say in order to write it down and preserve it, you see. But there are a lot of young people today who've grown up without the father in the home and the strong elderly influence and such. And so another reason why I wrote this is for people who grew up in that situation to see not only what it was like, but what they could learn from something like this to make it beneficial for them, and they could pass this type of thing on to their children.
I like the very detailed references, which a good storyteller always has, but it also connects to Charleston, because very often you'll have Mr. Potts saying, well, there was a time down at the corner of of king, and
Right.
you know what I'm saying? And all of a sudden, I find myself saying, well, I'm trying to remember where that intersection. Okay, I know where he's talking about. You know, so there is that detail, and you've got that history and that link, I guess, to the Low Country where your Mount Pleasant and
Right.
your downtown Charleston
Right.
roots still there, huh?
Exactly. Well, I grew up in this area. I was born in Spartanburg, and of some of that references in the book too. And I grew up in Mount Pleasant and in Charleston and such. And so naturally, you want to put a little bit of that in to capture some of the local flavor of what was lost. But I think that even people who are not from Charleston, there's enough of the things that are universal in this book that relate to people who have never been to Charleston or never even heard of Charleston for that matter. So it kind of covers all bases along those lines.
Are there more Mr. Potts and Me stories to be told, or how's this kind of unfold at this point?
I'm glad you asked me that because this book, incidentally, will be out on the 26th of July. As a matter of fact, it'll be in stores then. We're having a book signing the day before that, and I've already started work on a sequel to this of a lot of my father's other stories and others of elders and classics of folklore. It's going to be called American Storyteller.
I see.
So that will be the sequel to this.
And then I guess it's one of those deals where it takes two. I mean, you can have the best storyteller there is, but you got to have some people that are willing to listen too.
Exactly.
And sometimes I just don't know that we always want to listen. It's like, oh, here he goes again. And the reason I say that is because I've heard my kids say that, or my wife say, here he goes again with another one of those stories. But it kind of takes two.
That's true, but I'm going to say this about that. Many times children say that now about, uh-oh, here he goes again, but the day always comes when they're going to try to remember what you told them. And they're going to see the value of that as they get older. And one of the things that I try to do in the book is to make people realize before it's too late that you need to get together with your elders and put this stuff to pen and paper, because so many stories are forever lost to the cemetery because we didn't do that as people.
Very well. Mr. Potts and Me, it's a pleasure to see you again. All the
It's a
best.
pleasure to see you also.
All
Mr.
right, good to see you. All right, our thanks to Damon Fordham for joining us again. The book, Mr. Potts and Me, copies will be available for purchase, again, as you heard him say, end of July in area bookstores and on the Evening Post publisher's website. That's eveningpostbooks.com.